The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 1. The following chronicles I found among the effects of John Cecil, a distant relative of mine who has long been dead. They read like a romance in real life, and may perhaps be as interesting to others as they have been to me, especially to the many who are fond of the occult. LMD. Nay, let the souls throng round me. I am I, and you are you, we should not vainly seek. Would you not hear, though faint and far the call? Nay, were we dust, and had no life to speak, our very atoms, on the wind blown by, would meet and cling, whatever might befall. Stewart Plantation, March, 1865. An accident has made me the guest of Mrs. Harold Stewart, whose plantation is on the Ashley, a few miles from Charleston. Although I am an involuntary inmate of her beautiful home, I am accorded a cordial welcome, she being an old schoolmate and a very dear friend of my mother. I might as well record here that my name is John Cecil, age 26, an officer in the U.S. Army, and at present I am recovering from the effect of a fall from my horse, which occurred in this way. After Sherman's march to the sea, my regiment had been ordered to Charleston. On hearing this, my little mother, from the security of her northern home, wrote me in urgent terms to lose no time in going to her dearest Lucia, meaning Mrs. Stewart, and rendering any service that might be necessary during the troublous times that were sure to follow the downfall of the Confederacy, which now seemed inevitable. Accordingly, accompanied by my orderly one pleasant evening, I started on my mission. As I rode slowly along the highway, letting my thoughts go wool-gathering, an exclamation from my attendant suddenly recalled me to myself. "Look, Captain," he said. "Look at that fire over yonder. Guess some of our boys are reconstructing one of the natives." "It appears to be in the locality of the Stewart plantation, Benson," I replied. "Let's hurry on in case it is there." As I spoke, I noticed a by-road that led in the direction of the blaze, and putting spurs to our horses, we soon drew rein beneath the dense shadows of some huge trees that nearly enclosed a small clearing on the bank of the river, and became the unobserved spectators of an unusual scene. I wish I were an artist and could depict here on this page as vividly as it stands out in my mind tonight. A tall, fair girl is standing on the trunk of a fallen tree. Her fine form in its clinging white draperies is brought out in full relief against the dark background of the woods beyond, as the flames leap and writhe their long glaring tongues upward from a pile of burning cotton bales nearby, casting their ruddy glow upon her. A couple of brawny Negro men, black as Erebus, were feeding the fire from a pile of lightwood knots, and singing a weird refrain that had the effect of a banshee's wail. Nearby stood a white-wooled old darky, the impersonation of comical despair. Having failed to prevent his young mistress from carrying out her rash design of burning the cotton bales on the advent of the Yankees, he now seemed to derive much solid comfort in making plain to her the dire consequences sure to follow her folly. "I tells you what's the God's truth, Miss Dolly, honey. You all just show to get our family into tribulation by your carryings on. Here, you boys," to the two men, "just shut up that racket, will you? First thing you all knows, them Yankees is going to be down on us. Then what we all going to do?" to the girl. "Yas'm, Miss Dolly. No use tellin' me 'bout'n your pa. Reckon I was the last one ob the family that Mars Harold saw arter he rode off down the big road on the way to the war. And the last words he spoke to me, he says, 'Now, Lime, you hear me. If them Yanks ever get to Charleston and that cotton pile ain't run out the blockade, you just tetch her off. Miss Dolly'll tell you when the time comes.'" "Then, Uncle Limus, if Father ordered it—" "Law, honey," interrupted the old Negro, "your pa never believed them Yankees was going to get here. And then, just stop and think how your ma'd rar tire if she knowed what you was up to this minute." At this the girl laughed merrily. The long tongues of flame, catching new life from a fresh supply of pitch pine, leaped upward amidst showers of sparks and clouds of smoke. The wind swayed the long trailing hanks of gray moss that hung from the branches of the ancient trees, while the river, swollen by recent rains, could be heard rushing between its banks as it hurried seaward. The weird picture was lost on Uncle Limus, who continued, in a dolorous voice, his prophecies of coming calamities. "You all can laugh 'bout'n your ma, Miss Dolly, but she ain't priming to what them Yankees is going to be when they finds out that Wheels done burned up more than 1,000 bales of cotton, what Mars Abraham Lincoln want her to get. I reckon they all'll just chain me and the boys up to the stake and fire up the pine knots round us, just like they used to do the old witches." "Hush, Daddy," said the boys, drawing nearer. "Don't you talk 'bout them witches. They mout come out to flutterin' round here, sure enough." At this point I rode suddenly into the clearing, my orderly close behind me. The consternation I created could not have been greater had a witch actually fluttered into their midst. Believing that the Yankees were down upon them in full force, the boys stood not upon the order of their going. But the valiant old Uncle Limus stood his ground like another Horatius. Placing himself before his young mistress, he called out, "Hold on there, if you please, sir. Just a minute, sir." Then aside to the girl, "Cut and run, honey. Cut and run, for God's sake." Then to me, "Young master, I reckons you all think that we all's done burn this cotton pile. No, sir, I swear, sir, that we'll just come down here to extinguish it. I don't know no more'n you does just how hit cotch, less'n hit was sponternacious combustion. That was the way old Billy was burned up. He drunk a gallon of whiskey and then light his pipe, and that was the last of old Billy." While he was speaking, I advanced slowly and, careless of my rein, had just lifted my hat to the young lady, intending to explain my peaceful mission, when lo, my horse stepped on a live coal and reared so suddenly and violently that I was thrown to the ground. Then for many days I lived in a world of shadows, caused by concussion of the brain. And by the way, how strange it is that the jarring of a certain mixture of albuminous matter, water, fat, and salts, which compose my brain, should have expelled me from my body, as it were, into a world of phantoms, as real to my changed condition as all material objects had been before. However, Berkeley, Mill, and other philosophers have struck the true keynote in nature. There is no material world except that which is conceived by such a sentient, invisible, conscious thing as the mind is known to be. Then I want to know who were these people that during my delirium came and went and spoke to me in tones that cannot be registered by the normal human ear. Were they, or are they, as real as the so-called realities that are cognizable to my physical senses? Among these flitting unrealities, if such they were, was one who was continually by my side, and but for whom I would never have begun these chronicles. The impression is strong upon me that he is closely interwoven with my life, and what I shall now indite seems to justify me in my conclusions. End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 1. Section 2 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 2. Oh, 'tis a fearful thing to be no more, or if to be, to wander after death. Dryden. When I once more began to take cognizance of the things of this material world, my surroundings were so unfamiliar that it took me some time to realize my own identity. It was night. The weather was cool for this season, and a pleasant glow from the slow-burning log in the wide fireplace gave an air of comfort to the room, a large, low-ceiled apartment with heavy mahogany furniture, whose style had long been out of date. I closed my eyes, and for a time lay perfectly quiet in order to enjoy once more the pleasure of merely being. Outside the wind was wailing like a lost soul, while the silence of the great house was broken only by the monotonous ticking of the clock in the hall. After a while I opened my eyes and let them wander around the room. I noticed that the candle on the high mantel was flaring in a passing draught, and that its flickering blaze lighted up a portrait that hung above it. The picture was that of a man about my own age, small, dark, and handsome. As I met the gaze of its deep, mysterious eyes, I shrank back among my pillows, muttering an old couplet that flashed into my brain from somewhere. For by dim lights the portraits of the dead have something ghastly, desolate, and dread. But why should I think of this young man as dead? I ask myself. It is certainly very lifelike, and I can almost imagine it is a living face peering at me from an opening in the wall. As I lay watching it, unable, as it seemed, to withdraw my gaze, the candle flickered out, and the room would have been left in total darkness had it not been for the firelight. I could no longer see the painted face, yet I felt the intensity of its gaze. It seemed to penetrate my inmost being and to touch some chord of self-consciousness that hitherto had lain dormant. Surely my nerves must be sadly shattered, that I, John Cecil, hitherto a skeptic and a materialist, should indulge such fanciful imaginings. What have I to fear from a painted face, I ask, for if a man has a soul it is the same in the flesh or out of it. I resolutely closed my eyes and composed myself to sleep, but just as I was crossing the borderline, the creaking of the chamber door roused me. Glancing in its direction, I noticed that someone was entering the room very softly, as though afraid of disturbing me. It was a small, dark man, whose dress was of an ancient fashion. As he came forward and stood near the blazing logs, I observed carefully every detail, even to the buckles on his shoes and garters, whose gems flashed brightly as the fire suddenly flared upward, casting a weird light upon him. At first I was startled to see how much his face resembled that of the portrait. Then, like a flash, it came to me that it was also the face of the one who had so constantly attended me during my illness. Here, then, was a prosaic ending to my would-be mystery. I had already realized that my present weakness and unfamiliar surroundings must be consequence of an illness during which I had been unconscious, at least part of the time. But I well remembered the young man's face. His costume was, no doubt, one he had worn to some masquerade from which he had just returned, slipping into my room to enjoy the warmth of the fire before going to his own. I was glad of his companionship, so I was not displeased when he came softly to my bedside, seated himself in a large armchair, and, leaning forward, looked straight into my eyes. "So you are better, Captain Cecil," he said with a gentle sigh of pleasure. "What a time you have been out of your head, as they phrase it." "Have I been delirious?" I asked. "Then that accounts for all those strange people I have seen and talked with. They appeared so real, yet they were but phantoms." "Phantoms," he repeated as he fixed his dark eyes on me. "Are you quite sure of that? If you have studied aught of occult science, you must have heard that in and around this so-called material world there lies another, not perceptible by man's physical senses, yet as real as the one he does perceive. It is called the Astral world, and is peopled with myriads of beings whose constituent parts adapt them to their lives upon its plane, as readily as man is adapted to his life upon the earth plane. It is in this astral world that you have been for the past 10 days. His voice, if voice it were, was soothing, and to encourage him I simply smiled credulously, murmuring, "Idle theories, all." "No, John Cecil, this is not an idle theory, but a living truth. Of this you may be certain. About you is an astral world, and on the walls of this vast repository, every thought, feeling, and act of earth life is recorded in letters of fire. Here things without form take shape, and he who runs may ready the magnetic hieroglyphics that stand as living records of man's virtues and follies. The soul can perceive at a glance the experiences of its own many physical existences, as the vast panorama unrolls before it." "Many physical existences?" I questioned. "Yes, the various earth lives it has experienced. In other words, the soul remembers. Now, what do you understand by memory?" "Simply the revival of impressions made on the cerebral ganglia," I replied confidently, knowing that my statement is a scientific one. "If your definition is correct," he replied, "let us see what follows. We cannot class memory as an intellectual faculty unless we cede intelligence to the lower animals, since it belongs to them equally with man. Nor can we admit that it is a part of man's material nature, unless we are willing to grant that it perishes with the nerve tissues, of which it is a part, on their disintegration at his death. No, my friend, memory belongs neither to the intellectual nor to the material part of man. It is the capacity of the soul to look as with introverted eyes, into the vast picture gallery of this invisible astral world, so near and yet so far. It is here that Jocko Dreams holds his court, and here it is that your astral soul has wandered during your delirious hours, bringing back only confused memories of what it perceived there. "I must leave you now," he said. "Since your nurse is coming, keep my visit a secret. I ask this for private and personal reasons. Think well of what I have said, for I shall be with you soon again." As he disappeared, a pleasant-faced, middle-aged Negro woman entered the room. "Good Lord," she muttered. "I must have slept mighty sound. Never done dat way before when I was tending on sick folks. Here's the candle done burned down in the socket. Dat's a mighty bad sign. Hope dar ain't gwine to be a death in de family." Hastily lighting a fresh candle, she came softly to my bedside. When she found me not only awake but rational, her pleasure was truly sincere. "Bless God, young master, 'cause you in your right mind again. You's been out in your head ever since you fell off'n your hoss that night when the cotton bales burned. Miss Lucy," meaning Mrs. Stewart, "found your ma's letter in your pocket, and lawsy, she cried over you just like you been her own child. She just sot right off for your ma, and she's done come, and you can see her in the morning, so you all just swaller this here stuff with the army daughter left for you, and go to sleep, 'cause I done told you all there is to tell that's of any consequence." The following night, at my urgent request, I was left alone. I had easily persuaded my nurse to lie down on her cot in an adjoining room, from which soon issued sonorous sounds that told me she was out of my way. I soon fell into a light slumber, from which I was aroused by the sense of someone's presence, and on opening my eyes, I saw my expected visitor seated in the armchair that he had occupied the previous evening. After a few trivial remarks as to my condition, etc., he led easily up to the subject nearest his heart, that of occult philosophy. It was so restful to lie there at ease on my luxurious bed, and listen to his pleasant low-toned voice, like the music of rippling waters over pebbles. "Men continually have glimpses of this astral world that lies about them, yet they resolutely close their eyes and ears, believing themselves to be deluded by hallucinations. Another century, however, will bring new revelations. There will be means of communication between the dwellers on each. Even now, the photographic plate is known to be sensitive to rays of light that the human eye cannot perceive. There are millions of sounds that the dull ear of man cannot hear. But some day the bridge will be spanned, and he will comprehend that all the universe is animated by spirit." "Do you mean that after death our souls simply linger in this astral world and do not stand before the judgment bar, as we are told in the Holy Writ?" I asked. "Is there neither a heaven nor hell?" "There are conditions which correspond to your ideas, perhaps, of heaven and of hell, and these certain classes of humanity find themselves after death. But again, there is still another class of beings who linger indefinitely in the astral world I have told you of, such, for instance, as elementaries. Now do not confuse them with the elementals, for they belong to a different class altogether." "I know absolutely nothing of either," I replied, "but should like to." "Well, then, since it interests you, know that man is composed of 7 principles, united in life, but separable at death. Or, to simplify my statement, let us say he has a triune nature, the animal, the human, and the spiritual. To bring an illustration home, let us say, for instance, that I am a dead man." He paused and fixed me with his dark, mournful eyes. Outside I heard the low sighing of the wind and the distant hoot of the screech owl in the forest. An uncanny feeling seized me as I echoed, "A dead man." Was it fear that trickled along my nerves like liquid ice? I had faced death upon many a hot-fought field, and once as we lay all night upon our guns in a pelting storm, I had spread my blankets on some poor stark fellows who heeded neither the wind nor the rain, and I had slept soundly through the night. But never before had I felt such a trepidation of heart as when it was borne in upon my senses that I actually was face to face with a being who should, according to natural law, be in his grave. Not appearing to notice my emotion, My companion continued to speak in his low, pleasant tones. Let us assume that I was once a member of the old family who have owned this estate for more than a century, and that my death was sudden and violent. Now when my body, a mere mass of inert matter, was deserted by its higher principles, you call the change death. It was laid away in the old mausoleum that stands in a secluded spot on the plantation where other members of the family repose. Its life principle remained, and as it decomposed, these vital germs created new organisms, which in turn gave rise to others, and so on, so long as anything but dust remained. My spiritual part passed on to a higher plane of that hereafter. My animal and human souls have never gone beyond the earth's atmosphere. Why, do you suppose? Simply because when I was in the very flush of early manhood, while my whole being was impregnated with a fierce, all-absorbing passion, I was suddenly and by violence expelled from my body. Therefore, in obedience to a fixed law, I am compelled to linger near the scene of my death until that desire is gratified. The scene of my death, did I say? I misspoke myself, for in fact I am not dead at all. I have simply laid aside my body, as one would cast off garment no longer serviceable while I continue to exist in its ethereal duplicate. The fact is, Captain Cecil, I am an elementary. I do not understand, but he interrupted me a little disdainfully, I imagined. Neither do I, nor does anyone else understand even many of the simplest problems of nature. For instance, everywhere about us, in constant activity, is the force of catalysis, yet the wisest of mankind have never been able to explain just why. When a grain of wheat sprouts, 1 part of diatis changes 1,000 parts of starch into sugar. Then consider what asininity a man betrays when he denies a truth, simply because his little mind cannot grasp it. Yet the world is full of such, I murmur. Yes, and it is they who retard its spiritual progress. And now, John Cecil, I am going to tax to the utmost both your patience and your credulity, and I beseech you to listen to my story. The story of my broken life. I implore you to believe it, and to aid me, since you alone of all on earth can do so. I must speak tonight, because I dare not risk losing what may be my only chance, the chance for which I have waited so long, because there are certain fixed laws which regulate the invisible world as well as the visible one. Before it was possible for me to hold communication with a person on the earth plane, I had to find some being whose nature and conditions were not dissimilar to my own at the time of my death. This I have done in you. For instance, I was 26 years old at the time I left my body. You are now the same age. We were both born in the same month, and on the same day of the month. I had served my country in the field about the same length of time that you have. I was recovering from an illness that had almost cost me my life. And above all, the best condition is that our spiritual natures are not dissimilar. Tonight, the molecular vibrations of your astral being are in unison with mine. Or in other words, John, we are en rapport. This may not occur again. You must certainly understand now why I so earnestly beg you to hear me. And though my story may be tiresome, I shall not be long in telling it, since it need not be imparted to you by the slow process of human speech, to which poor souls in the flesh are limited, but by a series of impressions conveyed to your spiritual perceptiveness. The following is what he told me. End of Flight of the Shadow, Part 2. Section 3 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 3. The Story of La Pelletier. My name is Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier. I shall only go back to the year 1690, and briefly state that during the terrible persecution of the Huguenots in France, at that time 2 brothers La Pelletier were the only representatives of our family. One of them, my grandfather, was a staunch Romanist. The other, whose name I bear, was an enthusiastic Huguenot, and with others of his class found a safe asylum in Carolina. Here on the banks of the Ashley he built him a stately manor, and began a new life in a new land. At last, ripe in years, he was laid to rest in the stone mausoleum he had erected, and which is still standing. He was succeeded by his son, who bore his name, of course, and who was his only child. By this time the estate was a fine one. The broad fields of rice and cotton, tilled by numerous slaves, yielded an income that many a prince might have envied, and far exceeded that of my Romanist grandfather, whose property at his death was so heavily encumbered that my father's only inheritance was a gloomy old chateau on the banks of the Loire, whose scant revenues scarcely sufficed for the wants of our frugal household. Then my father, being a proud man, barred his doors, so to speak, against the world, and devoted himself to his books, leaving me to the companionship of our 2 ancient servants, or to that of the owls and bats that peered, even in the daylight, from the dusky corners of our ruinous home. I do not mean to say that my education was neglected. The priest from the neighboring cathedral gave me all necessary instruction for 3 hours every day, and my father himself taught me to use the foils, an accomplishment deemed indispensable in every gentleman's education at that time. I will not dwell on my youthful days, since my subsequent life is the one I wished you to understand. Therefore I shall begin with my 21st birthday, when I suddenly found myself face to face with death, and the doors of the world hitherto closed to me were opened. On that day my father was found stone dead. He was still seated in his armchair, with an open letter before him, a letter which, taken in connection with his death, changed the whole current of my existence. This was early in the year of 1776. Now the letter which had such an important bearing on my life was from the owner of the Carolina estates, my father's cousin, Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier, of whom I have spoken. His only child was a daughter, Jacqueline. In case of her marriage with one not of his own name, the estate of which he was so proud would pass, as it were, into alien hands. His adopted country was in a state of turmoil, war with England having already begun, so he had determined to set his mind at rest by arranging a marriage between his daughter and myself. As I bore his own name in full, he looked upon me as the true representative of his race. Such, in effect, were the contents of the letter. Such marriages of convenience are still of common occurrence in France. Therefore it is not strange that I gladly acceded to my kinsman's proposals, turning my back on the gloomy old chateau, and set out for the enchanted land where my fairy princess awaited me. At Dover I embarked on my cousin's own ship, the Jacqueline, which had brought its cargo to England direct from his plantation, and with fair winds we anchored in due time in Charleston harbor. I have not time to tell you of the welcome given me in my new home, nor of my emotions at beholding all the wonders that awaited me. Suffice it to say that to my unsophisticated soul every hour brought some new revelation, and life seemed a glorious heritage. My kinsman was the grandest specimen of manhood I ever knew. He was 6 feet tall, and proportionately built. His face was smooth-shaven, his dark hair always brushed back from his face and tied in a queue. His eyes, deep-set beneath heavy brows, spoke of an intelligence above the average, and his firm lips and massive jaws denoted his iron will. I shall never forget the first few moments of the scrutiny of his piercing eyes. It seemed to me he read every thought of my previous life, but his hearty welcome soon reassured me, and I at once took my place in his household as the affianced husband of his heiress. Now as to Jacqueline. I need only tell you that my acquaintance with womankind had hitherto been limited to old Julie, our one-woman servant, with her lonely yellow tooth and pronounced mustache, in order that you may understand at once how madly I loved my beautiful affianced from the first moment I beheld her. After all, John, the only true love is love at first sight, but oh, how deplorable the fact that it is not always mutual. God knows Jacqueline and I were both young enough to have indulged somewhat in romance, but not she. She had no thought of opposing her father's will, who had, and accepted me as an accompaniment of the trousseau, etc., that belongs naturally to a wedding. If I endeavored to express my adoration, she coolly held me off at arm's length, as it were. "Let us have no pretenses, Jean," she would say, holding her pretty head erect, and drawing back the hand I sought to capture. "Let us have no pretenses, or I shall hate you. You surely understand that, in wedding you, I simply fit my fancy to my father's will, as the poet says." Her cruel words cut deep into my soul, and I impulsively cried out, "Oh, Jacqueline, speak not thus. You must know that I love you better even than my own soul." Never shall I forget her glance of pity mingled with scorn. Oh, John, never make the mistake of showing a woman that you adore her. Feign indifference if you feel it not. Chase a shadow, it will fly you. Seem to fly, it will pursue. So court a woman, if she deny you. Let her alone, and she'll court you. But I digress, John. I seem even yet to hear Jacqueline's mocking tones. "Poor little cousin," she said, "you flitted so long among the shadows of your ancient chateau that any will-o'-the-wisp can mislead you into quagmires. Love is no mushroom to spring up in a single night." Her tone and look of superior wisdom caused me to lose all self-control. "A mushroom, sayest thou?" I cry out impatiently. "Why, girl, I loved thee centuries ago. I knew thee the very instant that my eyes met thine, though no memory of me stirred thy torpid brain. I knew thee for my own, and now I claim thee, body and soul. Remember the oath we swore that night beneath the palm trees on the Nile, even in the very shadow of the sacred Amun-Ra." John, it was not I, Jean-Jacques Lepelletier, who spoke. The words formed themselves and sprang hot from my lips as the memory of that far-off time stirred the depths of my subconscious self. Imagine their effect upon my young cousin. I saw that she doubted my sanity, and was cautiously drawing farther from me, preparatory to flight, when by an effort I regained my self-control. With a careless laugh, I said, "How do you like the passage, Jacqueline? It is from a drama that I am writing, and deals with the ancient doctrine of reincarnation, a doctrine as old as the very universe." "Ah," she replied with a sigh of relief, "I did not know that you were an author. But, Jean, if the true spirit of your drama is to be caught, you should act the leading role. But come, let us sit here comfortably in this arbor, while you tell me the plot. It appears to have the merit of originality at least." Without any previous knowledge of what I was about to say, once more the words came from my lips. "Centuries ago, a youth and a maiden loved each other devotedly. Fate forced them to part, and at their last interview, a stolen one, they swore an oath which bound their souls together through all eternity. These lovers were heathens, and did not believe that one little earth life could complete the growth of a soul. They had been taught that in all created things there is a latent spark called spirit. If once set free from its environments, it is caught up in the whirl of terrestrial evolution, and spun madly on from shape to shape, through many phases of existence, until at last it breathes as a human child. Now the two souls that were embodied in the youth and the maiden had met under various forms during the eons of time through which, groping their way through obscurity, stumbling to rise, casting aside animality, scaling the steeps of the skies, they had slowly progressed towards humanity, and when for the first time they recognized each other as immortal souls, self-conscious personalities, they loved and swore— "Oh, fie, Jean," interrupted Jacqueline. "What an unconventional couple." "That their love," I continued, without heeding her, "should outlast time and defy even death itself, that no matter on what plane or in what shape they met during their various reincarnations, each would claim the other." "My faith, but it's a weird story, Jean," said Jacqueline, "and savours somewhat of the strange doings at Salem, once upon a time. But tell me, by what token were they to recognize each other during their re-embodiments? A strawberry mark, perhaps?" "Now, Jacqueline, thou art laughing at me," I said good-naturedly, "and I will tell thee no more until some stormy night when we are sitting by the light of a blazing log in the gloomy old library, and the witches are holding high carnival on the lawn without. That is the time to make a weird story effective, ma belle." End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 3. Section 4 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 4. How I wish that instead of a pen picture I could show you the old manor as it was on the night of my formal betrothal to Jacqueline. It was burned to the ground by Tarleston, and this comfortable but plain mansion stands near its original site. I wish you could see the spacious parlors, more than 60 feet long, all ablaze with light from dozens of wax candles and chandeliers and candelabra. The lovely dames and courtly gentlemen, resplendent in costly robes and jewels, bewigged, patched, and powdered, walking the stately minuet, while their forms were reflected 100-fold in the numerous pier glasses that reached from floor to ceiling, and again in the polished oak floor, to which age had imparted the hue of ebony. It was like gazing upon a living kaleidoscope, like an enchanted dream from which I was soon awakened. At last I found myself alone with Jacqueline. The betrothal ceremony had been completed, the many congratulations received, the libations poured, and the guests were in the midst of their revels. We were standing in the hall beneath a large chandelier, and as she chatted gaily of pretty nothings, I feasted my eyes upon her, or let them rest upon her exquisite profile that was reflected in the tall mirror near by, while my heart repeated exultingly, "She is mine, she is mine, and no power on earth or beyond shall deprive me of her." Even as the unuttered words hung on my lips, a tremulous, icy thrill ran through every nerve of my being. One is said to experience such a sensation when somebody is walking over the spot that is to be his grave. Then in the mirror I saw the form of a young and handsome man rise between my betrothed and myself. His face was deadly pale, and his wide-open eyes were those of a somnambulist. One hand was raised with a threatening gesture, as though to ward me off, while the other appeared to clasp her waist. What wonder that I stared with dilated eyes at such a strange apparition, for such I knew it to be. Observing the horror depicted in my face, Jacqueline asked kindly, "Are you ill, Jean, or do you see one of Aunt Dorca's ghosts?" Her voice recalled me, and I hastened to reassure her. Then I led her forward to join the dance, forgetting for the time the uncanny face that afterwards brought me such dire disaster. Forgetting all else save the joy of the moment, and well for me that I could do so, for on the morrow all was changed. The British fleet are anchoring in the harbor by Dewey's Island, north of Charleston, was the tidings brought us as we lingered over our late breakfast the next morning, and well we knew the meaning of the news. Of course I was heart and soul with the patriots, and side by side rode with my kinsman to assist in the defense of Charleston. The gallant stand made by Colonel Moultrie and his brave followers on that memorable Friday has now become a matter of history. Yet I must say that I never beheld a grander sight than when the 50 British ships with canvas spread and flying flags came sailing into the harbor that bright summer morning, the clear sky above them, and the yellow sunlight dancing on the blue water. How my heart throbbed as they cast anchor with their broadsides toward our Palmetto fort, and from their black hulks 150 fiery mouths began to pour a deadly challenge. How gallantly the little fort withstood the fierce assault! The morning passed, yet our blue flag with its silver crescent still floated from the southeastern bastion, and our 26-pounders sent back their sullen defiance. At last Sir Peter became so enraged that he determined to make short work of it. Simultaneously his ships poured their broadsides into our fort. Down went the blue banner from the bastion. A dozen brave patriots lay wounded and dying. Among them was my dear kinsman, who breathed his last just as the air was wild with cheers at Jasper's brave act. The victory was ours, but what could atone for our personal loss? End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 4. Section 5 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 5. By my kinsman's will, I now became the head of our house, and accompanied by Jacqueline and her mother, returned to the plantation, where we each tried as best we could to take up the broken thread of our lives. The Patriots held undisputed possession of Carolina, but both armies were concentrating in the north, and from this point, from time to time, there came such stirring news that I was wild to be off. My aunt, divining my feelings, made no objections when I begged her permission to ride away with the gallant Lafayette to the north, where we joined General Washington in time to assist in disputing the passage of the Brandywine with Cornwallis. But I will not dwell on the many hairbreadth escapes that I had during the 3 years that I wore the buff and blue, since it in no wise concerns my story. Suffice it that, early in the spring of 1780, I found myself once more in South Carolina, cautiously making my way toward my home. Alas, what changes war had brought to this once fair state! The blackened ruins of many a stately mansion, and the deserted fields on every side marked but too well the track of Tarleton's fierce legions, or of the sanguinary Tory. My guide and I traveled only at night, and with the utmost caution. One day, as we were resting in our leafy covert, we were awakened by the trampling of horses and the sound of voices, and found ourselves in the midst of Buford's men. This intrepid colonel, with only 400 followers and 2 small pieces of artillery, was on his way to assist General Lincoln, then besieged in Charleston. "You may as well right about face, Colonel," said my guide. "I was near Charleston 5 days ago, and this is the situation. Arbuthnot is anchored within cannon shot of the town. Clinton holds the south bank of the Ashley, and Cornwallis, with 3,000 men, is overrunning the country east of the Cooper." "Then I must rejoin General Gates, since my little force would be useless here," said Buford. "I trust, Captain, that you will return with us, since it seems impossible for you to proceed." "I must reach home at all hazards, Colonel," I replied. "Every moment's delay—" My sentence was never finished, for close at hand rang out the sharp crack of a rifle, followed by another, and Buford's pickets came scurrying in, sounding the alarm. All was now confusion, for Tarleton and his bloody devils had surrounded us. To our surprise, we saw a party of men approaching, bearing a white flag, and found that they bore Tarleton's demand for our surrender. "It was useless to resist," he said, "for 700 horsemen encompassed us, and Cornwallis with a large force was ready to intercept us." My heart sank as I heard the words, for I did not know that they were false. While we were parleying as to terms, and our men, not suspecting treachery, were off guard, down came the redcoats upon us like an avalanche, cutting and slashing right and left with their drawn swords. The surprise was complete. No words can describe the scene. In vain the officers tried to rally their panic-stricken men. A few made feeble efforts at self-defense, then threw down their guns with the rest, and were made prisoners. I had a short encounter, hand-to-hand, with a thick-set, swarthy fellow about my own age, who was well mounted. Hearing me frantically appealing to the men to stand their ground and give them hell, he dashed at me full gallop, intending to ride me down. Fortunately, I was too quick for him, and saved myself by springing aside. As his sword came clashing down, I caught it on my own. A footman has the advantage, you know, in a case of this kind, because the mounted man must manage his animal. So I was in a fair way to rid my country of a deadly scourge, as I was getting the better of my assailant, who was the notorious Tarleton himself. But fate was against me. I was suddenly seized from behind by a couple of redcoats, and so quickly pinioned that I was a prisoner, before I could recover from my surprise. It is a marvel to me even yet how I escaped death, since on all sides Buford's men were butchered in cold blood. Only 53 were spared, including myself. The British quickly buried their own dead, only 5, but leaving our killed and wounded where they lay, began their march toward Charleston, taking the 53 prisoners with them. You may imagine my anxiety of mind on this wearisome march. Bitterly did I repent having left my kinswomen at the mercy of such a foe. I do not recall the number of days that we trudged along the dusty roads, when one evening at sunset we halted at a wayside inn, whose creaking sign announced entertainment for man and beast. But the bare room in which we were locked gave scant promise of its fulfillment. Tarleton, with most of his men, had ridden away to join Cornwallis, leaving us attended by only a small escort, which we could easily have overcome had not our hands been confined while on the march. As we neared Charleston, we found the redcoats literally swarming everywhere and in full authority. Therefore our escort became more lax in their vigilance, as though they thought an escape could only be followed by recapture, in which case we were told scant mercy would be shown. But we did escape, and successfully too. The landlord of the inn was in full sympathy with the patriots. He served the British with the best his larder afforded, not forgetting a plentiful supply of drugged wine. Then, while all were making merry, he slipped in among us, cut our bonds, and gave us such good cheer that we soon felt ourselves ready to respond, when he bade us to be prepared at a moment's notice to mount and ride away with the swamp fox, who was on his way to our rescue. About midnight the signal was given. Silently, one by one, we crept out in the darkness, cautiously followed our guide to where the horses stood ready and mounted. Then the whispered directions. "Ride eastward to the clump of live oaks. Marion and 30 of his men are waiting there for you. There are holsters at your saddle-bows. Go, and Godspeed you." The whole affair had been so excellently managed by mine host that in half an hour we were riding swiftly along the moonlit highway in company with the gallant partisans, fearing nothing from the sleeping foe we had left behind us. All night long we rode, and when morning dawned it found us safe in sanctuary, so to speak, since our island retreat was hidden in the midst of a vast swamp, and was accessible only to the few who knew the secret path leading to it through the dense woods and quagmires. But in my state of mind rest was impossible, and when our scouts brought news of the bombardment and surrender of Charleston, I could delay no longer. Marion, too, had begun to grow restless, so one evening, in company with a score of his brave spirits, he started out, as he said, to put a flea in the ear of a few too arrogant redcoats. Of course, I could not lose the opportunity, and suggested that they escort me at least part way on my perilous journey. My extreme anxiety in regards to my kinswomen caused me to be doubly cautious, since were I made prisoner they would be left entirely without a protector, and yet my presence might only serve to increase their danger. However, I was determined to see for myself how they were situated, and gladly set off with my partisan friends. We kept well in the bypaths and beneath the shadows of the trees, whose long trailing banners of gray moss served as excellent screens. What strange wild creatures my companions appear, their long hair and unkempt beards seeming to form a part of their coonskin caps. How noiselessly they creep forward, muskets in hand, their buckskin moccasins making no sound as they press the yielding earth, and I almost believe them to be fantastic shadows instead of brave, tried men ready to die for their cause and country. When we reached the forest that belonged to the La Pelletier plantation, the locality of which was well known to these native Carolinians, we decided to reconnoiter before advancing into the open field. While we were conversing in low tones, our leader, who was somewhat in advance, gave the signal, and we quickly and quietly took cover. Then came the sound of hoof-beats, a cloud of dust, and a party of redcoats galloped in sight. They drew rein in front of a corn-crib and dismounted. We knew by their led horses and empty pack-saddles that they were simply a foraging party who would soon be on the move again. At work they went shelling the corn in order to facilitate its transportation. From time to time came bursts of merriment from the crib, which told of the circulating canteens. Of course, the gallant partisans could not resist giving the unsuspecting redcoats a little surprise party. Only a narrow wagon road separated them from the crib, which stood on the edge of the clearing. They sprang across the narrow road, and uttering such yells as I had never heard before, they surrounded the crib and began to fire volley after volley through the door and between the unchinked logs. But the redcoats are not the men to die like rats in a trap. Out they rush, pell-mell, meet their assailants hand in hand, and then they have it, hot and close. As for me, I have only a confused recollection of saber strokes, sharp bayonet thrusts, and the dull thud of a musket, as some poor fellow's brains are dashed out, and of dreadful groans intermingled with oaths, then oblivion. The fray had begun about dusk, but night had already closed in when I became dimly conscious. I had been left where I had fallen, and lay among the dead. I attempted to rise, but could not move a muscle. To cry out, but my tongue refused utterance. Then a dreadful fear possessed me. Was I dead? I recalled a theory that I had often heard my father advance, vis-a-vis that the dead retained consciousness until the very last atom composing their material bodies had been disintegrated and had returned to its original elements. The thought was torture. Perhaps I should be cast into a pit with the bodies around me, there to lie day after day, my consciousness bound to the decaying mass. But my sufferings were of short duration, and my heart gave a joyous thrill at the sound of familiar voices, which I now heard. Then I saw old Uncle Daniel's honest black face shining in the light of the blazing pine knot he held aloft, in order that my dear Aunt Mary, who was close behind him, might see her way. They paused near me, yet despite my utmost efforts I cannot make my presence known. How ludicrous Uncle Daniel's protestations sound! Only a Southerner can understand the liberty an ancient servant takes in remonstrating with or advising his master or mistress. He was saying, "I tells you what, Miss Mary, you-alls oughtn't to be fooling round these here dead corpuses, especially in de night time, honey. Marse Marion's done kyawed off all of his men what got hooded, and me and the boys'll tote the rest of these down to the swamp in the morning. No, honey, this ain't the place for white ladies."
"Peace, Daniel," said my aunt. "If you are afraid, give me the torch, and get you back to your chimney corner and your pipe."
This silenced the old negro, and despite his terror he still kept close by the side of his mistress, as she went from one to another of the prostrate forms, seeking in vain for signs of life. At last she turned to leave. I heard her sigh.
"Poor fellows! Many a woman's heart will ache for this day's work."
Again she approached and paused beside me. The hem of her dress brushed my hand. Never had life seemed so sweet as at this moment when it hung on the slender chance of a look. Then, like an inspiration, came the remembrance of the strange power that lies in the magnetism of a fixed gaze. I riveted my eyes upon hers, concentrating all my will-power in the one wish that they would meet mine. She grew uneasy, then began to peer anxiously around, and finally she took the pine knot from Uncle Daniel's hand, bent over me, and in its glare looked straight into my eyes. Then I felt myself slipping down into a black abyss, and knew no more for the time. I had only fainted from weakness and loss of blood, as you may know. When I regained consciousness, I found myself on a low trundle bed amid unfamiliar surroundings. The ruddy glow from the burning logs in a great fireplace, and the tallow candles on the mantel dimly lighted up the whitewashed logs, a bare, unpolished floor, and furniture of the plainest description. Yet there was an air of comfort about the place which gave me a sweet sense of rest, and when the soft murmur of familiar voices reached me, I knew that I was at home again, and was content. How thankful I was to lie there, and feast my eyes upon my true love's bonny face. How lovely she was as she sat half-reclining in the high-backed chair, with the flickering light playing hide-and-seek among her clustering curls. The slender girl of 18 that I had left was now a charming woman of 22, unchanged, save in a riper loveliness. The years, however, had left traces of care upon my dear aunt. How worn and worried she looked, and what anxiety was in her tones as she took counsel in regard to my safety. From their conversation I soon learned that the British torch had left our noble manor only a heap of ruins, and that my dear kinswomen were sheltered in the log cabin once occupied by the overseer, that they had confided their fallen fortunes to the care of Uncle Daniel, and had remained on the plantation, contrary to the advice of those who urged them to follow the popular course, and seek the protection afforded by the city, if they would simply promise allegiance to King George. But they willingly chose independence, loyalty to their faith, and Uncle Daniel, and truly the valiant old hero had proven himself worthy of their trust. He gathered together such animals as had escaped the general ravage, and transferred them to an island in the swamp. Here he and his 2 stalwart sons made a safe rendezvous, and unmolested cultivated such vegetables as were needed, kept their poultry undisturbed by British foragers, and their good old cow, which never failed to supply her share of the milk and butter. Occasionally a deer was stalked, and the river yielded an abundance of fish. The old man made weekly trips to Charleston, exchanging his load of truck, as he called it, for such little luxuries as the family needed, and bringing back his budget of news of the gay doings in the city, and the latest raids of the bold and dashing partisans. So despite their homely surroundings, my kinswomen managed to live in some degree of comfort, and to maintain the honor of their house, which forbade affiliation with an enemy in arms against their country. Such was their condition when I once more became an inmate of their household, a dangerous inmate, for should my presence become known, they would be involved in absolute ruin. Uncle Daniel fully realized this.
"I tells you what, Miss Mary," said he, "you all better let me take 'em down to the swamp with the things. The Tories never find 'em down there, and the boys'll take care of 'em."
"What an absurd idea, Daniel," said Aunt Mary. "He will be safe enough here. We have no visitors now, and the British have not left us anything worth coming after. We will keep a sharp lookout to prevent surprises. Tobias can act as sentinel, and if anyone is seen approaching, can warn us. Then, you see, we can easily push the low trundle bed your young master is lying on under the big four-poster, and the valance will completely conceal it. At any rate, Daniel, this seems to me the only plan, for his life hangs on a slender thread, and we must save it." So it was settled. A simple arrangement, but the best one possible, it proved, having shortly afterward been put to the test, when our little sentinel Tobias came bounding into our midst with the announcement that "the Tories am coming," and a party of redcoats were seen approaching. My aunt quickly pushed my trundle bed out of sight, and then, to make assurance doubly sure, donned her nightcap and climbed up among her pile of feathers on the big four-poster, where she played the invalid so successfully that the enemy soon went their way, leaving her undisturbed. I fain would linger on those happy days of my convalescence, John, those pleasant days when I was so near my heart's delight, but I must pass on to one awful day, the day which brought the death of all that made life dear to me, and shattered my peace of mind forever. End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 5. Section 6 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 6. The afternoon was warm and sultry, and my bed had been placed before the open window, commanding a view of the long avenue bordered by tall poplars, which led to the house. I had been lying there during the pleasant hours as one entranced. Jacqueline had been reading Rasselas aloud, yet I had scarcely heard one word, so wrapped was I in love's delusive dream. The shaded gallery overrun by a profusion of multiflora, the warm sunshine flooding the long-neglected lawn, the feathery date palm, whose long graceful plumes scarcely stirred, all stand out in my mind's eye as in a living picture. I can even hear again the pleasant whir of Phoebe's wheel at the far end of the gallery, and the quaint song with which she now accompanied it, breaking the silence that had fallen upon us since Jacqueline had closed her book, and succumbing to the drowsy influence, had fallen asleep. I lay idly watching Phoebe as she walked backward and forward, her bare feet making no sound on the board floor, deftly drawing out the long, slender rolls and skillfully guiding them as they are swiftly converted in smooth threads and are whirled around the revolving roach. The words of her song fell as idly on my ears as some rustling wind among dead leaves, but how prophetic of my own sad fate. "Oh, wale, wale, but love is bonny when it is new. But when 'tis old, it waxeth cold, and fades away like the morning dew. Oh, whencefore should I busk my head? Oh, whencefore should I comb my hair? For my true love has me forsook, and says he'll never love me mair." All at once Tobias came bounding up a by-path, his one garment a long tow-shirt, fluttering in the breeze, his little black legs making one step cover three, and shouting, "Oh, Miss Mary, the Tories am comin', the Tories am comin'." In a twinkling my trundle-bed was out of sight. Phoebe had scarcely begun to twirl her knee again, my aunt to resume her knitting, and Jacqueline her reading, when a horseman appeared coming swiftly up the avenue. A slit in the valance permitted me to see without being seen myself, and as I watched the approaching redcoat I felt no warning, no presentiment of coming evil. I remember to have thought what bad taste was displayed by the British in their garish uniform, but confessed to myself that it well became the young officer now approaching. As he drew rein, he looked about him with a bewildered air, as though expecting to find some better habitation than a log cabin. Then, seeing the ladies on the gallery, he sprang from his horse and advanced towards them, his face aglow with pleasure. They arose to receive him with the dignity the occasion seemed to demand, but he, bounding up the steps, paused, dropped his outstretched hands, and said in tones of disappointment, "What, Aunt Mary, don't you know me?" "Why, I would know you anywhere. Am I so changed? Yet I am the same Harold, your own nephew, that you left 8 years ago, and this is cousin Jacqueline. I know it is, although my romping cousin seems quite a dignified spinster." Then all stateliness has vanished, and Harry dear cousin Harry is greeted with a warmth which apparently ignores the fact that he wears the uniform of the tyrant George. As I look more closely at this man's face, my brain seems to reel. Where had I seen it before? When? Where? Suddenly a hand of ice seems to clasp my heart. My God, it is he, the thing that had stood between me and my love on the betrothal night, and warned me back with such a menacing gesture. The same face, no longer pale, but with rosy pleasure, yet the same. What had brought him across the sea that night, when his body lay asleep at Oxford? This thought chilled my blood, for as I listened to the conversation I found that he had recently left school to enter the army, and that he had just arrived, it being his first visit to America. John, I will not dwell on my sufferings then, unless you know what jealousy is you cannot understand them. Afterwards I tried to laugh away my fears as groundless. I brought reason to bear and said to myself, I am the husband chosen for her by her beloved father, whose slightest wish has been sanctioned by his death. She is such a staunch little patriot that she would soon scorn an alliance with one in arms against her country. Had she chosen to receive homage from the redcoats, she could have taken part in the gay doings at Charleston, and queened it over any fair dame or damoiselle. But her patriotism has caused her to deny herself the pleasures common to youth. Yet here I am harboring a passion fit only for the canaille, merely because she receives her cousin with a show of cordiality. Notwithstanding my logic, I was unable to regain my peace of mind, and trifles light as air kept my reason in perpetual conflict with my pride. How readily Jacqueline found excuses to condone what she termed her cousin's unfortunate escapade. I soon learned that Harold Stewart was the only son of Aunt Mary's widowed sister, whose home was in a pleasant suburb of London, and whom she had visited when Jacqueline and Harold were in the bread-and-butter period of their existence. And by the way, John, your hostess, the mistress of this plantation, is a lineal descendant of this same Harold Stewart, having married her cousin, who also bore the name. I was, as a rule, ashamed to make my jealousy too manifest, and constantly exerted the utmost self-control to conceal it. But on one occasion I said, Jacqueline, methinks you are somewhat gracious to a man who wears the colors you so recently detested. Perhaps you already regret your denunciation of the gallant Tarleton to his face, and would accord him a welcome also, since one of his minions is greeted so cordially. Ignoring my sarcasm, she replied, You refer, of course, to my cousin Harold. I admit that it is deplorable to see him in a red coat. It is ill becomes his pure Saxon style. How handsome he would be in buff and blue. I knew that those colors were entirely unsuited to my sallow skin, and I will confess, John, that my vanity was somewhat touched. Men are vain creatures, after all, and if women only knew this secret— But I digress. The colors themselves, Jacqueline, signify but little, I said. It is the principle they represent, of course. She laughed saucily at my solemnity. Why, Harold is not in sympathy with King George's principles. Is not? I replied. Then what excuse has he for being in King George's pay and holding a commission from the tyrant? At this the hot blood mounts to her cheeks and brow, and she turns scornfully away to leave the room. But on second thought she pauses and says haughtily, Sir, your words show me that you are as small in nature as in stature. They deserve no answer, but this much I will say. Until 2 months ago, Harold was a student at Oxford, paying but little attention to the broils in which England is engaged. He had no idea that we, his American cousins, had espoused the cause of the Patriots because so many Carolinians are loyal to the king. When the school term ended, in company with several of his classmates, he took service in the king's cause because he was weary of the inactivity of his student's life, and looked to war as a means by which to win renown or enjoy adventures. It is but natural that he should regret his course, since Mother and I are in sympathy with the Patriots. Then she walked away, and for some days pointedly avoided me. I can scarcely describe the conflicting emotions that tore my heart during this time. Wounded pride, egotism, jealousy, and despair made me feel that Dante's Inferno was no myth. Oh, how I longed to be once more afield where the chances of war might place me face to face with this accursed villain. His daily visits, protracted sometimes for hours, made concealment on my part impossible, for I had no mind to be skulking under the bed, while he was enjoying the uninterrupted companionship of my betrothed. How he paled and winced when first introduced to me, and he became aware that I was the intended husband of the girl he loved. And when at last I was able to walk about on the gallery, and could interrupt their pleasant tete-a-tetes, what malicious pleasure I took in assuming the rights of proprietorship over her, and in making him feel that an insurmountable barrier separated him from the girl he was mad enough to love. A word to Clinton, and the barrier would have been removed, are your thoughts, John, and true enough, but I must give him the credit of being an honorable man, withal, since he must have been sorely tempted, and no doubt had many a cruel battle with himself, for after all, self is a hard master, who holds the whip hand over most of us. At last he began to lure Jacqueline out for rambles about the plantation. When I put forth my feeble protest, it was promptly overruled by my aunt. "Jacqueline has not been well of late," she said. "I am sure it is the close confinement, since she has been accustomed to an outdoor life. She must have more exercise in the open air, and who so suitable a companion as her cousin Harold, since you, Jean, are unable to accompany her?" Then there arose in me a strong, overmastering desire to be whole and well once more, and I spent hours praying for this. The man of Galilee had healed the sick, made the blind to see, and had even raised the dead through faith. Or might it be that he held the key to a simpler secret? For instance, may not all material conditions be merely misconceptions of the mind, and exist only as they are conceived by it? No one can explain just how the nerves control the muscles. Now, may there not exist a finer set of activities that control the nerves, and through them man's whole physical being? I grasped these thoughts as a drowning man grasps a straw, and held to them by night and by day. And the results? Well, explain it as you will, my recovery was so rapid as to be simply marvelous. One afternoon my siesta was longer and more profound than usual, and I awoke with the full conviction that I was strong enough to leave the house unattended, and walk once more beneath the sky a free man. I knew that Jacqueline was somewhere in the grounds with her Tory lover, and I went forth gloomily enough, yet fully determined to bring matters to a crisis. So far I had been silent, and had submitted as best I could to the inevitable, since my Aunt Mary held the laws of hospitality as sacred as her creed. But now I began to understand that in doing so I had committed a moral wrong. Since I had left the woman, I should have shielded from temptation to the power of the tempter. I hesitated no longer. Taking a short sword from the wall and throwing a dark cloak over my shoulders, I went slowly along a bypath that led through the neglected grounds, my mind filled with bitter thoughts. At length I reached the old mausoleum, and seated myself on a stone bench beneath the shade of a group of date palms, which even then were almost a century old. This ancient place, though overrun with shrubbery, stood on the edge of an open glade that had in happier days been used as a tennis court. Encircling this court was a grove of orange and magnolia trees, from whose branches a pair of mockingbirds were pouring floods of delicious melody. As I looked from my shadowy retreat across the sunlit glade, a weird fancy seized me. The sad story of King Oedipus took hold of me, and so wrought upon my nerves that for the time I seemed to myself to be he, sitting as once he did, listening to the nightingales as they sang in the Garden of the Furies. Almost unconsciously I found myself repeating his words. "Within dense flocks of nightingales are singing sweetly," etc. Any schoolboy is familiar with the passage. Then from the shadows of the tangled foliage a gentle voice seemed to answer.
"Beware, it is a spot not to be touched. Awful goddesses possess it, daughters of primeval darkness."
"Then come, ye daughters of primeval darkness," I continued, still using, as you know, the words of the unfortunate king. "Come and compassionate this phantom of a man in Oedipus, for indeed this is not he who was once I." I doubt not but that these seemingly vagrant fancies were suggested by some kind of unseen influence to warn me from the spot, but in vain, for they are forgotten as suddenly as they come, when my ear catches the sound of approaching voices, and my eyes rest upon the pair I had come to find, Jacqueline and her Tory lover, who are walking slowly across the sunlit glade and directly towards me. They pause near me, and their words fall upon my heart like clods upon a coffin lid. His arm is around her waist. His hand clasps hers, while his eyes are bent upon her tear-stained face, as though to read its every thought. I can see her yet, my dearest love, and hear her sweet voice saying,
"O Harold, I cannot, I dare not. I am bound to him by ties that death has sanctified." "Dearest," he replies, "such ties are feeble threads when compared to the strong cords of a true love, which binds two souls so closely that even death cannot unloose the knot. Your dear father would not knowingly have doomed you to a living death by forcing you into this hateful marriage. He did not love the empty bauble of a name more than his only child." He spoke in low, persuasive tones, and as his words fell on my ears I stood as one stricken with paralysis. Murder, red-handed, rose in my heart, tempting me to slay him where he stood, traitor that he was, and give him no chance to defend his life. But thank God for the long line of gentlemen who stood between me and my faraway origin, and warded off, as with drawing swords, traits which mock the orders who are the slaves of their lower passions. I was true to my heredity, so with a mighty effort I calmed myself. I measured at a glance his short sword in its burnished guard that hung from his belt, and soon saw that it matched my own. So far we were equal. In point of physical endurance, of course, he had the advantage, but this consideration did not enter my mind. I stepped quietly forward and stood beside them before they were aware of my presence. My appearance must have been wild and haggard in the extreme, for even before I had spoken a word, Jacqueline shrank back pale and trembling and turned to retrace her steps, while he prepared to follow. I had no intention, however, of permitting him to escape so easily. Touching him on the shoulder, I said, "Stay a little, sir. I have somewhat to say to thee." "Say it quickly, and have done then," he replied haughtily, and faced me as boldly as though he were an innocent man. This so exasperated me that despite my resolution to be calm, I cried without further ado, "Coward, defend thyself! En garde!" The words had scarcely left my lips ere his blade was out like a flash, and he was in position ready for me. Our swords crossed in salute, and at a glance we measure each other. His cold, still blue eyes, which return my fierce gaze without flinching, tell me that I have a foeman worthy of my steel. Then we go at it hot and fast, like two devils in whose veins run icy fires. We advance, retreat, thrust, feint, and parry, with no human eye to witness. With what fury we fight! Ah, John, strange as it may seem to you, the molecules in this immaterial form of mine, even now, move faster among themselves as I recall that duel. Would that we had weapons, and that you were yourself. I would show you some of our strokes. They were marvelous pretty. But the end came, and I lost, not through lack of skill, but because my hour had struck, as you shall see. He thrust caught over my arm. I parried tierce, and returned the thrust in tierce. Then he forced a thrust without advancing. Of course I parried prime, intending to disengage over his arm and return the thrust in second, delivering it under the wrist and elbow to a point between his right armpit and breast. You see, my move would have been the correct one, and had it been given, would have changed my whole destiny. But at the very instant I parried prime, Jacqueline came running toward us, uttering the most piercing shrieks, and my hand paused. It was only for the fraction of a second, yet long enough to herald an eternity for me, since my adversary, quickly recovering, struck my blade aside and thrust his own through my body. My next sensation was that of being upheld and upborne by some
strong unseen force, through darkness and silence, swiftly, noiselessly, on, and ever upward. At these words, I, John Cecil, impulsively interrupted my strange visitor. For had not my experience so recently been identical with that he was relating? So I cried out, "I perfectly understand you, Pelletier. The sensations you describe have also been mine, though perhaps in a dream. Let me relate them. I remember riding into an open glade at night where some cotton bales were burning. Then a sudden blow, and all was blank. After a little I felt myself borne swiftly upward and onward, through a darkness most intense, through a silence most profound. It was not the uncertain, darting flight of the swallow, but the steady, unwavering soar of the eagle. No tongue can describe the feeling of perfect peace and rest that possessed me, and the mighty effort it cost me to come back, when from the far depths below I heard a voice calling to me. I resisted, obeying it with every effort of my being, but in vain. Some law compelled me to return. I would open my eyes to find myself in my body, and then once more I would escape from it, and soar away in silence and blackness through limitless space. And so, like a shuttlecock in the hands of fate, I was thrown back and forth between this world and another, until the dream vanished. "It was no dream, John Cecil," said my visitor. "No dream, but of that I shall tell thee later. For the present I must go on with my story, and again I implore you to believe me." End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 6. Section 7 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 7. Unlike your experience, after a period of oblivion, I did not awake in the flesh. Yet for a time it was difficult for me to realize my condition. I was dazed, confused, bewildered. I found myself once more on the plantation, amid the scenes in which I had played my part, among those whose daily lives had been so associated with mine, yet I might as well have been at the North Pole. I myself was unchanged. The same thoughts surged through my brain. The same impulses actuated me. I was still Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier, and yet I was not. How can I make you understand me, John? What words can express my suffering? What pencil portray my agony? To be absolutely unable to manifest my presence or my feelings. To stand by, helpless and unseen, while my betrothed was wooed by my detested rival. To watch them, day by day, as preparations went forward for the wedding. Cecil, on my knees, I implored Aunt Mary to refuse her consent to the marriage, but she neither saw nor heard me. I shrieked curses into his ear, but he was deaf. As for Jacqueline, the worldling, she seldom gave me a thought, after her first outburst of remorse had passed. Many a night I tried every means in my power to force my personality into her dreams, and thus awaken in her heart some feeling of regret for me. But all in vain, for if she dreamed at all, it was of him. Oh, how I longed for the power to communicate with my aunt, to tell her that I was not dead, only changed in condition, and that I would not release Jacqueline from her vow. At last I thought of Dorcas, the old negress of ghost story notoriety. No doubt she possessed those mediumistic powers which went by the name of witchcraft. So, one evening I purportedly placed myself in her path as she came from the spring with water, a bucket balanced on her head, and one in each hand. Now, when in the flesh, I had always been a great favorite with Aunt Dorcas, owing no doubt to the small change that often made its way from my pocket into hers. But when I stepped suddenly from the shadows into the moonlit path, and began my appeal to her, she fled with a wild shriek, dropping her buckets, and not even looking back. The only result of this hope, you see, was to add another ghost story to an old Negro's long list. Surely the world is peopled by blind fools, one half through egotism and the other through fear. But why dwell longer on this unhappy time? It goes without saying that the marriage took place, that my betrothed wife became the bride of another, while I stood by, a silent, helpless witness of it all. The ruins of the old manor, destroyed by Tarleton, were cleared away, and this colonial mansion built, and here the happy pair began their new life. But their happiness was short-lived. for 2 years later Jacqueline died suddenly of heart failure. When they left her body alone in the mausoleum, I uttered prayers of thankfulness, for now I could claim her again, not her body, but her astral soul, which I hoped would soon appear, for I believed that she too would be earthbound as I am, that I might in our changed conditions be able to win the love she had denied me, and that somewhere, somehow, together we would begin another life. But I was doomed to disappointment. Although fond of life and its pleasures, she was not wholly engrossed by any earthly passion. Her affinities were pure and elevated, and her real ego moved onward toward a higher spiritual plane, leaving behind it simply an empty shell. True, this resembled her earthly body, but it possessed no more consciousness than a cloud floating in the sky. I felt no regret when I saw it gradually fade away, since this would ensure her a quicker reincarnation in the flesh. Now nature works in circles. Jacqueline's psychical entity did not complete the perfect circle of its physical existence, but was thrown back into the great realm of being, its mission unfulfilled. I knew it would soon be returned to earth in a material form, because nature always lends every energy to restore the harmony of a violated law. Long, long has been my waiting. 100 years have passed almost, yet what are they but grains of sand on the seashore, when reckoned with eternity? And my patience may be rewarded, for John Cecil, as truly as you are you, and I am I, eternal and unchangeable save in outward forms, Jacqueline Le Pelletier does live again on this earth plane, and in a material body. Now she is known as Dorothy Stewart. "What?" I cried out incredulously. "The daughter of my hostess? The fair young girl I saw the night of my accident, and who came to visit me today?" Then it flashed upon me that I was dealing with a lunatic, whose idle vagaries I had humored so long as they seemed harmless. But now that they began to draw Miss Stewart into their giddy vortex, it was best perhaps to check them. But my strange visitor, divining my thoughts, held out his arms imploringly, and in his soft, persuasive voice, which in spite of myself held me as though spellbound, continued, "Oh, John, as you hope for mercy, be merciful to me, and hear me to the end, for I have now reached the point towards which the lines of my long, and it may be tiresome story, have converged, and I beseech you to believe that that which I am now going to tell you is the living truth." He fixed his dark, mournful, unfathomable eyes on mine, and once more his voiceless words sank into my soul. "From what I have already told you, you must know that I, who speak to you, am not really I, the true and higher ego, who once animated the material form of Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier. The being before you is only an astral soul, an elementary, a creature possessed of only a portion of the constituent elements of the real man. This body, although an ethereal copy of my fleshy one, is subject to the same laws of decay that it was. When once the desire which holds it earthbound is gratified, it will be thrown back into the great reservoirs of nature appropriated to it. Yes, this is my astral body, animated by some of the lower principles, and I, the real man, the everlasting, O John, I am once more in the flesh. Did I not tell you that man has a triune nature, the animal, the human or mental, and the spiritual? That my animal and mental part remained earthbound in this astral body you see, while my higher part passed on. When my spiritual ego was liberated from the flesh, it separated itself from its lower principles and was drawn by the law to a higher plane of existence, where it would have rested an indefinite time, had not its affinities drawn it earthward again. This oscillation between the conflicting attractions of matter and spirit hastened my reincarnation, and I was born again. I cannot explain the mystery of this new sentient being. I say new, because when some unseen power touches the springs of nature, and a human child is the result, its constituent part and powers are new, although its spiritual monad may have passed through many phases of existence. The I am I remains unchanged, save that it has stored away the joys and sorrow, the triumphs and defeats of its old lives. The idea is repulsive and the philosophy cold and cruel, I said. What is any life worth if one loses his own personality and no longer knows his loved ones?
"It is your egotism that speaks now, John," he replied. "Just recall the 7 ages of man. Is the infant mewling in his nurse's arms to be identified with the lover sighing like a furnace? And what trace of the soldier full of strange oaths, etc., can be found in the lean and slippered pantaloon? Yet each is the same, and I assure you that the pantaloon cares as little about the soldier as the soldier does about the lover, or the lover about the mewling infant, and so it is in our various lives. And now, John, let me tell you, the dream you spoke of, where you were borne through space, was not a dream, but an actual experience. The voice that called you back to Earth, the power that tossed you like a shuttlecock to and fro between 2 worlds, was your affinities drawing you earthward towards reincarnation. Your affinities? My affinities would be a fitter term, since you, John Cecil, and I, Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier, are one. In you, my spiritual ego lives, reincarnated in your body. And oh, Cecil, believe me when I say that you alone can free me from the meshes of the law that holds me earth-bound." I echoed in bewilderment, for while he has been unfolding his strange ideas, I have become fully convinced that I am listening to a madman, and am not sure whether I shall humor his vagaries or summon assistance. I quickly decide on the former, of course, and ask quietly, "What can I do for you?" "This," he says solemnly. "You fully understand now that you who are known as John Cecil are really Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier. You also understand that Jacqueline lives again in Dorothy Stewart. You know what holds me earthbound, the great unfulfilled desire, the unwon love of my spirit's mate. It once was mine, but has become estranged, and I must win it again before I go on to a higher plane of existence. It was no idle tale that I told my beloved Jacqueline that sunny day, of the youth and the maiden, who in that faraway time loved each other so madly, but who were forced to part. The oath they swore of eternal fidelity as they stood beneath the shadow of Amun-Ra cannot be broken, and now as then Jacqueline is mine. She is mine. I care not by what name she is called, nor in what land she dwells. An adverse fate has parted our souls for ages, but now in the ever-revolving circle the point has once more been reached when our lives must touch and intertwine. When Dorothy Stewart is thy wife, John Cecil, Jacqueline will be mine. You will love her under her new name as madly as I loved her nearly a century ago. She may be hard to win, but oh, Cecil, do not fail me. And now I must leave you. When morning dawns, you will recall your experience of tonight and believe it a dream. To convince yourself that such is not the case, I charge you to go, as soon as your strength permits, to the old mausoleum of which I have spoken. Open the casket that holds my dust, and you will find my signet ring, which bears the coat of arms of our house, a stag trampling a crown, truly symbolic of the spirit of my Huguenot ancestor. It is also carved on the keystone above the mausoleum door. Wear this ring, for it is yours, having been mine. It will be a link between us, and is the emblem of eternal life. You can easily identify my casket, since it stands quite apart from the rest, on a slab at the north of the vault. I place my trust in you, John Cecil. For God's sake, fail me not. It may be that I cannot speak to you again, but I shall be near you continually, and whatever power I have, I shall use to aid you in accomplishing my purpose. End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 7. Section 8 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 8. As he ceased speaking, I heard the shrill voice of the chanticleer announce the break of day, and Uncle Limas in the adjoining room began to move about. Then I found myself alone. For some moments I stared like one bewildered at the vacant chair. Then I closed my eyes and strove to shut out the wild fancies that surged through my brain. Oh, the horror of it! To be a human Philopena, as it were. 2 kernels in one shell, 2 personalities in one body, each one of which might at any moment assert himself in spite of the other.
It was enough to drive me mad. Luckily, I was recalled to the world of realities by a cheery voice that contrasted pleasantly with the weird, vibrating tones that had fallen like measured strokes upon my soul all night. "Hi there, Mars John. I was powerful glad that you was getting yourself again. Aunt Patsy, that's your nurse, she told me to stay here with you till she come back. I's Limus, Mars John, or Uncle Lime. I's done born on the place. I nursed Mars Harold, and I'd gone to the war with him, but we both couldn't leave Miss Lucy. Lawsy, Mars John, if I'd known that you'd all belonged to the family, I wouldn't have been so scared that night when the cotton pile burned." I felt so glad of human companionship that I let him chatter on unchecked, interrupting him only to inquire, "Whose portrait is that above the mantel, Uncle?" "Oh, that's one of the old timers. He belonged to the family. He's done been dead a long time, and they tells me that he's buried out there in the solemn, along with the rest of the family." "And the young man, Uncle Lime? Who was the young man that went out just before you came in?" "Young man?" he repeated. "Why, Mars John, that warn't no young man round here. Reckon you must have been dreaming." Dreaming? Yes, beyond all doubt it was a phantasmagoria of the brain, called up by the association of ideas awakened by the uncanny portrait, by my weakness, my unfamiliar surroundings, etc. It is all a jumble of nonsense, I repeat, that will fade from my mind with returning strength, and I will think no more of it. Vain resolution. My nerves must be sadly shattered, for when alone I tremble at every sound, lest my weird should suddenly appear again, and, like the ancient mariner, hold me with his glittering eye. At last I determined to chronicle the strange incidents, using my pen as a confessional safety valve, hoping thereby to exercise whatever power it is that has thrust itself unbidden upon me, to rob me of my peace of mind. I have written, word for word, all that has occurred, and since no eye but mine will ever see the words, it matters little how like the disordered imaginings of an unsound brain they seem. With returning strength I wander through the house and about the grounds, and find the days of my convalescence pleasant ones indeed. The spacious house was built in the old colonial days. The wide hall, with its polished oak floor and stairway, the quaintly carved mantels above capacious fireplaces, the low-ceiled airy rooms, the broad galleries, and above all the air of genial hospitality about the whole place, make it very charming to me. Of course the desolating effects of the war are to be seen on every hand. Most of the Negroes left the place after the Emancipation Proclamation, and as Colonel Stewart, the owner, was killed at Chancellorsville, the plantation was left without a master. The fences are gone or broken down, the gin and rice houses empty and deserted, and the cotton fields overgrown with weeds. Yet, despite these discouragements, I have yielded to the persuasions of my mother and Mrs. Stewart, have consented to undertake the management of the place, and, if possible, to put it on a paying basis. Today, for the first time, I went into the library. It is an oak-paneled room but little used, where shadows lurk in dusky corners. On the walls hang the family portraits. The old Huguenot and his wife occupy central places over the mantel. On the right are the beloved Uncle and Aunt Mary, known to me through the sad story of my ghostly visitor, a story that finds something about the place to confirm it every day. On the left of the mantel hang life-size portraits of the fair Jacqueline and Harold Stewart, the husband of her choice, from whom the last owner of the place, Colonel Harold Stewart, is directly descended. I shall not repeat my visit to that room soon, for I do not care to endure the sensations again that I felt as the concentrated gaze of those painted eyes were fixed upon me. With an effort, I shook off the feeling of superstitious awe that possessed me, and returned the gaze of each one deliberately, and perhaps defiantly. Then I stood reverently before Jacqueline and studied her exquisite face, seeking in vain for some resemblance to the imperious, self-willed Dorothy Stewart, who was a refined repetition of her Huguenot ancestor. I cannot imagine her fitting her fancy to her father's will, as Jacqueline is said to have been willing to do. It would have been Greek meet Greek, had the old Huguenot undertaken to dictate the choice of a husband for her, I imagine. I record it here and let it stand. Dorothy Stewart is far removed from my ideal woman, the woman I have hoped to meet some day and make my wife. And yet I have been told that I shall wed her, that it is my doom to love her. We shall see. Mem. This fantasy of the brain which men call love may, according to Ovid, be overcome by observing 3 simple rules, to wit, avoid her presence, avoid idleness, think of her faults, and magnify them. Now I have so studiously observed the first that I believe she is piqued into a desire to humble me. As for her faults, no need have I to magnify them. Vain, spoiled, capricious, stubborn, yet with no stability of character, self-willed only for self-gratification. End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 8. Section 9 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 9. Today I heard her singing one of her quaint old songs. He that would woo a maiden must not dally. He must make hay while the sun doth shine. He must not linger with a shall I, but boldly say, Maiden, thou must be mine. In spite of myself, I paused a moment in passing, as her sweet fresh voice came through the open windows, near which she was seated, and was favored with a coquettish glance from her merry eyes. A glance meant to be my undoing, but failing in its purpose since my heart is guarded. Despite her faults, Dorothy is very charming. I will be candid enough to admit that. I cannot describe her, and would not if I could. Every man knows beauty in a woman does not consist of a particular shade of hair and eyes, nor in certain curves and contours of face and form, but that it is something above and beyond these that holds his soul enthralled. This mysterious power of fascinating seems to belong to Miss Dorothy, since... I shall leave that sentence unfinished, remembering 6 other idiots who would verify it under oath. It seems that not only immaterial but material forces are at work to bring about my marriage with Dorothy Stewart. Not an hour since my precious little mother frankly told me that she and dearest Lucy had set their heads on it. "Oh, Mother," I said, affecting great astonishment, "how can you plot against the happiness of your only child? Think of her temper, of her self-will, a shrewish Catherine." "Then be her Petruchio, John," she said sweetly. "But, aside from her temper, she is a flirt, a coquette," I said. "Why, John," she replied, "how little you know of women. Coquettes make the best wives in the world. They weary of adulation and insincere compliments, and more than any other class of girls, they thank heaven fasting for a good man's love. Believe me, John, it is Miss Wallflower whose head is turned by shallow flattery to which she is unaccustomed." Oh, cruel-hearted mother! If Miss Dorothy should marry me, what would become of Willie Clinton, who dotes on her waltzing, and of Paul Buford, who sings those tender love songs with her, and of Colonel Rexford, that dark-eyed, melancholy prototype of Edgar of Ravenswood, who appears to be the most favored one just at present? Think how he would pine for his daily canter by her side beneath the leafy avenues, or the wild gallops across the breezy uplands. "There they go now, John," said my mother, looking through the window. "What a handsome girl Dorothy is, and how well she sits her horse. Truly, they are a fine couple, but you should be her escort, John." They are indeed, as my mother says, a fine couple. The colonel is in the prime of life, and very distinguished in appearance. He still wears his Confederate gray, and rides a fine chestnut that has carried him through many a battle, while Dorothy, in a black habit and hat, is mounted on her favorite Diablo, whose jetty sides shine like satin. As I watched them canter easily down the broad avenue, an icy hand seemed to grip my heart, and for a moment I felt capable of murdering the handsome colonel. Is this jealousy? Am I in love? My mother's eyes are on my face, and I turn impatiently to leave the room, for I feel that she has read my heart, but she lays a detaining hand gently upon my arm. "John, dear, we have never had any secrets from each other. Now tell me why you so resolutely resist this love you feel for Dorothy." "Because, mother, she is incapable of a steadfast affection, because she has no place for me in her inconstant heart, whose net claims all as fish that come within the limits of its sweep, because, above all—" But here I checked my ready speech and became confused. How could I tell my practical, prosaic little mother the ever-haunting fear that lurked in my heart of hearts, that I was the tool of unseen powers, and that any love Dorothy might feel for me would perhaps be only the outgrowth of some hypnotic influence which I had unconsciously exerted over her, an influence which might disappear at any time, leaving her bound to me by sacred ties, yet loveless. May 1st. Avoid idleness, dear Ovid. That part of your remedy for love is easily applied when one undertakes to reconstruct a demoralized plantation. No idle time has hung heavily on my hands for the past few weeks. I fear the task I have undertaken would be but poorly performed, had it not been for the timely assistance of numerous cousins, who, after General Lee's surrender, received a hearty welcome from Cousin Lucy, and a home beneath her roof. But now, as I look over the fields, where the hens are busy weeding the young plants, I confess to a feeling of pardonable pride. The warm steaming weather favors the growth of the crop, which promises to be heavy, and although it costs more to now lay the bales on the wharf than it did before the war, the advanced price of the staple itself makes the profits greater. I am well pleased with the outlook. May 10th. I make this entry simply to put into words the thought of Dorothy Stewart's cruel nature. I met her today down in the rice fields. Thither she had come attended only by a Negro boy, who bore a cast of falcons on a cadge, which was strapped on his shoulders. Both were mounted on gentle ponies, and rode slowly over the ground, which was still wet from the outgoing tide, pausing occasionally to scan the horizon, as though searching for some object between it and themselves. On seeing me, she called out cheerfully, "Well met, Captain Cecil, especially well met if you are fond of falconry. See my pretty peregrines. They were sent to me from England when only branches, and I have trained them myself. That is, I and Napoleon." And she indicated the Negro boy, whom I remembered to have seen around the stables. "Falconry?" I queried, somewhat surprised. "I thought that sport was obsolete." "Oh, Captain Cecil, you are away behind the times. It is very popular now in England and in France. The Empress Eugenia has given it her sanction, which puts it in high favor. My peregrines are now enseamed and summed, to speak in the language of falconry, but in plain words, they each have a new coat of feathers and are in working trim. Just see their lovely pounces. Let me introduce Nero and Aspasia." As she spoke, her attendant removed one of the birds from the cadge, and she perched it upon her left wrist, which was protected by a thick glove. I looked at the peregrines curiously, never having seen any of the species before. They each were about a foot long from tip of beak to end of tail, were of bluish-gray color, barred with a darker tint, and their white breasts marked with black lines. Their hoods and jesses were of white embossed leather, their bells and varvels of silver. As I watched these gleaming in the sunlight, my weak heart framed the wish to hood the fair falconer, put a pair of silver Morosco bells upon her pretty ankles, and hold her in leash as she held her falcons. Meantime she was saying, "There surely must be a heron somewhere on these flooded fields," as she scanned the surrounding marshes, shading her eyes with her unoccupied hand. "Ah, there he is," she said joyously, "and what a beauty!" Following her glance, I saw, not 100 yards away, a lovely white heron, intent upon finding his evening meal in the shallow water, and all unsuspicious of the fate awaiting him. Quickly the bird on her wrist is unhooded and cast off, followed by the other, and on the still air rings out Dorothy's cry of encouragement, "Hoo-ha, ha-ha-ha! Hoo-ha, ha-ha-ha!" as the falcons spy the quarry. The heron hears, he feels the presence of his foes, and quickly disgorging, he rises in the air, his long neck and legs extended in a straight line. Eager in pursuit, the falcons follow, circling around and above their quarry, their graceful gyrations embodying the poetry of motion. I watch them with intense interest, forgetting to pity the heron in the unequal struggle. Suddenly the tercel, with closed wings and outstretched legs and talons, swoops impetuously down to grasp his victim. But with great adroitness the heron dodges him, and the falcon is carried swiftly forward by its own momentum. Then Aspasia circles above the heron, high in the air, and again swoops furiously downward, her sharp pounces ready to bind her prey. But once more he eludes her, and she is swept by. The poor heron, however, has no time to recover, for circling above him and preparing for the onslaught, he sees a second enemy in Nero, who once more attacks him. Unconsciously I had followed Dorothy, who kept near the combatants, her clear voice ringing out words of encouragement, her eyes ablaze, her cheeks aglow, and her whole form palpitating with excitement. Never had I seen her appear so beautiful. I could easily imagine her the embodiment of some barbaric queen, cheering her gladiators on to their bloody work.
"Well done, my Nero! Bravo, sweet Aspasia!"
she said, clapping her hands, as the falcons bind their prey, and all three begin to gently descend to the ground, for this strange battle has been fought mid-air. Dorothy, seeing this, quickly dismounts and runs toward them, for her precious peregrines must not be injured by the desperate heron, which, though harmless in the air, is often a formidable antagonist when brought to bay on land. Napoleon follows with the lures, 2 lovely snow-white pigeons, secured by long cords. On hearing her call them, her well-trained falcons soon desert the larger for the lesser prey, and as they tear the quivering flesh of the helpless living lures, the Negro boy secures their leashes. I turn away in disgust, intending to leave the spot, for, although when my blood is up on the battlefield I can hold my own in killing my fellow man, who in his turn has his hand raised against me, I never could endure the sight of suffering in a dumb animal. But my sensations vanish when I hear Dorothy's voice calling me back. She is kneeling beside the wounded heron, which Napoleon is holding, and dressing its wounds tenderly, having come prepared with salve, court plaster, and other necessary appliances. There is something kind and womanly about her after all, I think as I watch her. At last the surgery is over, then clasping a narrow circlet on which her name is engraved around the heron's leg, as she watches him limp slowly away, she says with not a note of pity in her voice, "I do hope the creature will get along all right, because any sportsman who captures him will know that he has been my falcon's quarry by the circlet on his leg." This, then, was why she had played the Good Samaritan. How this girl fascinates me. If any occult influences are at work, it is she who exercises them, not I, for I seem only to be a helpless victim. I abhor her cruel sport, and the sight of her falcons, yet as we rode homeward in the twilight I found myself pointing out a brown bird in the tall grass, and half in jest, quoting an old line, "If I love you not, I would laugh at you, and see you run your head into a noose and cry, 'A woodcock!'" "Where?" she says eagerly, drawing rein. "Oh, that is only a quaw bird, a poor quarry, but it may amuse my pets." The falcons are again cast off, and soon capture the poor bird, which took vain refuge in the tangled underbrush. "And so you call this sport, Miss Dorothy? There are those who might term it cruelty." "Cruelty?" she said, surprised. "I do not understand why. God is all love, yet all creatures made by his hand prey upon one another. The heron and the quaw bird were each following this law when my falcons surprised them. The fish, frogs, and insects which they were devouring had in their turn devoured other creatures weaker than themselves, and so on, ad libitum, down the endless chain of life, even beyond the domain of the microscope. The vast realm of nature is red in tooth and claw with ravine. It is the law. If God permits, he must approve." What? This blasphemous woman my wife, or worse yet, it might be the mother of my children. I avoid looking at her that she may not read my thoughts, and lightly changing the theme I soon frame an excuse, and ride away to a distant part of the field. 2 hours later I am her slave again. We were all at supper when she came in, radiantly handsome in her white mull gown, with a large cluster of crimson roses in her corsage. As she walked slowly down the long, well-lighted room, my first thoughts were of the white heron and its blood-stained breast, and of the snowy lures so ruthlessly sacrificed. But these were soon forgotten under the spell of her enchantment. Has this modern Circe turned me into a swine? And is there no bold Ulysses with his sprig of moly to undo the cruel work of this fair-tressed goddess, born to be my bane? End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 9. Section 10 of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ben Tucker. The Flight of the Shadow, Part 10. August 1st. Our womenfolk are all at Old Point Comfort for the summer, so the cousins and I have the house to ourselves. We have no time, however, to be lonesome, since cotton picking is in full blast. There is no need now, as under the old conditions, of an overseer riding through the long avenues of white-balled plants, urging the laborers to their tasks, since they are paid by the pound and board themselves. A much better arrangement financially for the planter when the market value of the money invested in each slave is considered, besides the expense of his food, clothing, and his invariable propensity to shirk tasks that brought him no apparent remuneration. August 10th. At dusk, as I was leaving the office, Uncle Limus, who now is my right bower, so to speak, came shuffling up, hat in hand, and, touching his woolly foretop, said, "Mars John, Ma'am Milly says she hope you all will 'scuse the liberty, but she lack powerful well for yer to step round to her cabin. She got something particular to tell you." Ma'am Milly has long been on the superannuated list. In passing, I have often noticed her sitting beside her cabin door, always smoking a cob pipe, and looking more like an Egyptian mummy than a human creature. Of course, I could not refuse such a simple request, so I stepped round. She was waiting to see me, and had donned a new red cotton-head handkerchief in honor of my visit.
"Young marster, please to 'scuse poor old nigger for axing yer to come to dis here ornery cabin, but I's all cruppled up with the rheumatiz and couldn't get ter the office, and I's just bleeged to see you."
"Oh, that's all right, Mammy," I said reassuringly. "No trouble at all. Tell me, what can I do for you?"
"Nothing for me, young marster. I's done on my last legs. Miss Lucy takes good care of me, and when I go to glory, I's going to give her my call. I was born with a call."
This was said with so much pride that I instinctively felt to be born with a call, whatever that might be, was a distinction devoutly to be wished, and said something to that effect.
"Yes, sir," she continued, "I was born with a call, and that am the wherefore that I is just bleeged to see you, young master. I reckon you done know that a person born with a call can see things that other folks can't." Then very impressively, "They can see ghosts."
"You don't say so, Mammy," I said to humor her. "Have you ever seen one?"
"Lawsy, honey, I's done seen lots of 'em. Why, they dead folks come round here, and 'tain't just like they was live. Now, don't you be scared, young master, but I's just bleeged to tell you about a spirit that is follerin' you round all the time."
"Following me?" I exclaimed, somewhat startled in spite of myself. "Well, Mammy, what does it look like?"
"It is a young man, master, just 'bout as old as you is, though he is a regular old-timer. His clothes look jest like the kin that old master used to wear. Silk stockings, big buckles on his shoes, knee breeches, and his velvet coat is cut so curious. His hair is plaited in one plait, just like a girl's, and his shirt bosom is all ruffled with lace. Many such as ironed for old master in my day."
I am so astonished that I cannot interrupt her to ask a question, for she is describing my midnight visitor, my weird, so to speak.
"Don't think old Milly's a lying to you, young master. I doesn't lie when one foot is the grave. That young man goes right along with you all the time. He appears to be talking to you, but you don't pay no attention to him. Then one day he comes up to me and says I smoking here by the door. I knows he is a spirit, but I ain't scared, 'cause I's done got used ter seeing him. 'Ma'am Milly,' he say, 'you tell him to go and get that ring, I mean him,' and he pinted at you. He come every day and says the same thing, so that I just feel bleeged to send for you and tell you."
"Why didn't he tell me himself?"
I said. "That's just a question I asked him, and he said, kinder sorry like, 'cause Mammy he done sot himself dead agin me, and I can't talk to him no more. Then I promised him that I'd tell you, young master, and I has."
I have set down my interview with the aged crone in plain black and white, hoping thus to shake off its effects, for I confess to myself that it has affected my nerves somewhat. But, pshaw! Shall I give a moment's thought to the babblings of a half-witted old woman? No doubt she sometime saw the portrait of Jean-Jacques, and dreamed her interview with this spirit. But the ring. The message was imperative and to the point. Is it a mere coincidence, or... What, am I still in doubt? Am I a fool and a coward to boot? The first, possibly, but the last, no. I will settle the matter at once and forever by going straight to the bottom of it, and proving to my morbid fancy that it is playing me tricks without rhyme or reason. It is now midnight, therefore a fitting time for my gruesome quest. I am alone in the house, save for the cousins who are fast asleep. At hours since, the air was full of merry makings, the cousins in the parlor enjoying bachelor freedom, smoking, singing, etc., while from the quarters came the sounds of banjos and fiddles, mingled with shouts of pleasure, calling forth by some particularly scientific achievement in the way of a pigeon wing, a double shuffle, or perhaps a backstep as a dancer patted juba in the moonlight. But now all these have ceased, and the mysterious brooding melancholy of the night is abroad. Shall I postpone my quest until daylight dissipates these uncanny influences? No. If the ring is there, it will be a material proof of... what? This shall be my last entry for some time to come, since I leave tomorrow for Europe. My absence can be easily explained, for business really calls me to Liverpool. When I am once across the big pond, I shall remain until the change has so ministered to a mind diseased that I can once more assert my personality and maintain it. As it is, I scarcely know whether I am John Cecil or Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier, or both. The self-same ego, but now enclosed in a new instrument of sensation, its remembrances being for the time obscured. Is it a living truth that man's spiritual development must be worked out through many lives? The idea dates back to the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, and to other ancient peoples, yet how little it is understood. It really places the scheme of creation on a grander scale to conceive of spirit as an unconscious principle, first thrown off from a great cosmic center, working its way in obedience to blind, inexorable laws up through various phases, until at last it merges into a glorious self-consciousness beyond the conception of man in his present low state of spiritual development. After all, how narrow and bigoted the theology that makes man subject to divine grace or wrath, which punishes or rewards him through endless eternity for the pitiful blunders or poor successes of one human life. But away with such idle speculations. They shall soon be refused admittance to my brain, when I have left this uncanny place behind me, and when my good ship is in mid-ocean, I shall cast overboard the signet ring, and thus obliterate the tie that would bind a living man to a dead one. The ring! Oh, yes, I have not yet written how I obtained it. And to do so, I must go back to the night of my last entry before this, the night on which I resolved to set at rest all my doubts in regard to the gruesome matter. As I have said, although it was midnight and my nerves were sadly out of order, I determined to visit the old mausoleum, and to convince myself that I was only a foolish dreamer. Putting a candle and some matches in my pocket, and securing the necessary tools, I went forward resolutely enough, all the bulldog in my nature being for the time uppermost. The mausoleum stands in a lonely place, and is almost hidden by the dense growth of shrubbery around it. A cool breeze coming in from the sea waved the long, curving branches of the date palms beside it, throwing fantastic, dancing shadows on the moonlit walk, shadows that might have been cast by a bevy of witches at their midnight incantations. As the huge iron door of the mausoleum swung back on its creaking hinges, and I found myself suddenly confronted by the black, yawning chasm, I drew back hesitating, but for a moment only. Despite the chill sent through my frame by the icy draught, I resolutely lighted my candle and went forward, holding it high above my head as I peered around. When my pupils had accommodated themselves to the light, or rather to the lack of it, I saw that the place was about what I had expected. It was a low-ceiled room, whose walls were discolored by dampness and age. On its smooth side, a row of coffins were arranged on stone benches, while on the opposite side, and quite alone, stood the one for which I was looking. How oppressively silent the place was. Not a living thing in sight, except a black bat that hung from the ceiling, and as I pried at the lid of the coffin, watched me from its wicked little eyes that were intensely human. When the lid yielded, I paused to summon up my flagging courage before removing it, and peered around in the darkness, half expecting a whispered reproof. But the silence was unbroken save by the dull thuds of my own heart. Then, with reverent hands, I put aside the lid, and held the candle so that its rays fell directly within the casket. Great God, what a sight met my eyes! There lay Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier, as he had been placed 85 years before, perfect in every detail, from the calm face, ghastly and cadaverous, to the silken hose and high-heeled shoes. Even the laced ruffles at breast and wrists were there, and on the fourth finger of his delicate hand was the ring. The body lay beneath what appeared to be a veil of transparent gauze. It retained its shape but an instant, for as soon as the air came in contact with it, and even as I looked, it crumbled away. But in the midst of the little heap of dust I saw the gleam of the ring. I hastily secured it, and then, followed by my weird companion, the black bat, I hurried from the gloomy place, thankful to breathe the fresh air once more and to have the open sky above my head. It would all seem like a horrible dream were it not for the ring. That is not made of such stuff as dreams are by any means. It is the very ring that Jean-Jacques Le Pelletier described to me. Therefore I cannot account for its being in his casket by calling the fact a coincidence. Nor can I say it was suggested by my subconscious self, since I could not by any possibility have known anything of a jewel that had lain in a tomb for 85 years. But why should I seek to longer unravel this tangled skein of mysteries? My only safety lies in flight. I must break the spell that some unseen influence has put upon me, leave the uncanny place forever. And most of all would I flee from the cruel madness of love, sings the poet, and I echo his words. I will not trust myself to even think of her, will close and lock these chronicles, leaving them packed with a few favorite volumes to be sent to me in the future, where or when God alone knows. Addendum. It is due to anyone who has read the story, if such it may be called, of John Cecil, to add the 2 clippings taken from a newspaper published at the time of his death. Disaster at sea! The Hesper, an American ship bound from Liverpool to New York, was wrecked on Blackwater Bank, through the captain's mistaking Blackwater for Tuscan Light. Out of 400 passengers, only 4 were saved. Then followed a list of those lost, among which was the name of John Cecil, Charleston, South Carolina. Married! On the evening of December 30th, at the residence of the bride's mother, Dorothy, only daughter of Mrs. and the late Colonel Harold Stewart, was united in marriage to Colonel D.N. Rexford, a gentleman well known and highly esteemed in this and other southern cities. The usual account of the brilliant festivities of the occasion, the dresses, etc., etc., followed, and so the curtain falls. End of The Flight of the Shadow, Part 10. End of The Flight of the Shadow by Laura M. Dake.